My beloved brothers and sisters, let me ask you something today. When was the last time you sat in silence, truly in silence, with no noise, no lyrics, no distractions, just you and your heart? We live in a world where every second is filled with sound. From the moment we wake up, there's music in the car, music in the gym, music in the background of every video we scroll through. We are constantly surrounded by rhythms and beats, but have we ever stopped to ask, what are these sounds doing to my soul? Many people ask today, is the hadith about music even authentic? Is it really forbidden? What's wrong with listening to something that just relaxes me? Let's pause for a moment, because this question isn't just about a hadith. It's about our connection with Allah, our spiritual sensitivity, and our hearts that were designed to find peace only in His remembrance. When people ask, is the hadith about music weak, they often approach the question from a defensive position rather than one of genuine curiosity. Deep down, the heart already feels the discomfort. It senses that something about music may not align with the spiritual path, yet the mind begins searching for loopholes, for validation, for a way to make peace with what it enjoys. The real challenge here is not about the authenticity of a narration, it's about the conflict between desire and discipline, between what soothes the ego and what nourishes the soul. The truth is, when we question whether the hadith is weak, we must ask ourselves why we are asking in the first place. Are we sincerely seeking the truth? Or are we seeking permission to continue doing what we already know may harm our spiritual state? This is the difference between a heart that wants guidance and a heart that wants justification. One leads to humility and clarity, the other leads to confusion and denial. In matters of faith, the intention behind a question often reveals more than the question itself. When someone truly seeks knowledge, they approach it with respect and sincerity. They say, I want to understand what pleases Allah. But when someone seeks loopholes, the tone changes. Is it really that bad? Maybe it's not haram, maybe that hadith isn't even authentic. That mindset reveals not a thirst for truth, but a resistance to submission. Islam is built upon surrendering one's desires to the will of Allah, even when the heart struggles. True faith is not about making religion fit our lifestyle, it's about shaping our lifestyle around our faith. It's important to remember that Islam doesn't fear questions. In fact, questioning is a part of growth. But there's a difference between questioning to learn and questioning to escape responsibility. The companions of the Prophet all did and also asked questions, but their purpose was to get closer to Allah, not to challenge divine boundaries. When they asked, they sought understanding, not justification. And that sincerity made all the difference. In today's world, the question about music isn't new. It's asked over and over because we live in a time when music is everywhere, in stores, in cars, in social media, in the background of every moment. It has become such a normal part of life that abstaining from it feels strange. So when someone hears that Islam warns against it, their immediate reaction is disbelief, not because the evidence is unclear, but because the heart has become attached. And when the heart becomes attached to something, it begins to defend it, even against truth. So when we say, is the hadith weak? Perhaps we should first examine our relationship with what we're defending. Are we seeking weakness in the hadith, or are we ignoring the weakness in our own willpower? Sometimes the real problem isn't that the evidence is uncertain, it's that our desires are too strong. The Prophet must have warned that in the end times people would find ways to make forbidden things appear permissible, not because revelation changed, but because hearts hardened. Therefore, the question we should ask is not, is this hadith weak? But rather, what is this teaching me about my attachment to the word? When something becomes so difficult to leave that we start arguing with revelation, that's a sign we've let it occupy a space in our heart, meant only for Allah. The believer who truly loves Allah asks, will this help my soul grow? Will this make my remembrance stronger? That's the question of sincerity. The real test lies in whether we are ready to accept the truth when it challenges what we love. The believer does not bend revelation to fit his comfort. He bends his comfort to align with revelation. So when we discuss the authenticity of this hadith, let's remember it's not just about chains of narration or scholarly terminology. It's about the state of the heart, asking the question. A heart that truly wants Allah will never argue against His guidance. It will seek clarity, accept wisdom, and strive to purify itself from anything that distances it from the one it longs to meet. Over the centuries, the hadith about music and its permissibility has been examined by some of the greatest scholars in Islamic history. Their interpretations reveal the depth of Islamic scholarship and the care with which they approached issues affecting the heart and soul. Rather than treating the matter lightly or simplistically, they analyzed it from every angle: the authenticity of the narration, the purpose behind it, and its spiritual implications on the believer. What emerges from their discussions is not simply a yes or no about music, but a comprehensive understanding of how sound influences faith, behavior, and inner peace. Among the earliest and most prominent scholars to discuss the hadith was Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, who considered it authentic and firmly upheld that musical instruments were not permissible because of the spiritual harm they caused. He explained that music distracts the heart from the remembrance of Allah and opens the door to desires that weaken faith. In his writings, he compared the effect of music on the soul to that of wine on the body. Both intoxicate, one physically and the other emotionally. Ibn Taymiyyah also observed that gatherings where music is central often become places where sins are normalized, laughter becomes excessive, and modesty is forgotten. His approach was not to condemn sound itself, but to highlight how indulgence in entertainment dulls the remembrance of the Creator. His student Ibn al-Qayyim expanded on this idea in his famous works Igadat al-Lafan and Madarij al-Salikin. He described music as the Quran of Shaitan, explaining that while the Quran softens the heart toward obedience, music often softens it toward heedlessness. He noted that people who indulge heavily in music find it difficult to taste the sweetness of prayer and Quran because their emotional satisfaction is already being fulfilled through melodies rather than through remembrance. Ibn al-Qayyim wrote extensively about how music fuels emotional highs and lows, creating dependency rather than peace. He did, however, make a clear distinction between permissible sounds, such as the daf hand drum, used in celebrations, and musical gatherings designed for worldly pleasure. His focus was always the same. Anything that distances one from Allah cannot bring benefit, no matter how pleasant it feels. Another classical scholar, Imam al-Ghazali, took a more nuanced approach. He acknowledged that sound, rhythm, and poetry can have a positive effect on the soul when used within proper limits. In his monumental work, Ihya Ulum-al-Din, he discussed music and singing in the section on spiritual purification. Al-Ghazali did not dismiss music outright, but emphasized the intention and context behind it. He said that if the sound reminds a person of love for Allah, gratitude, a reflection upon life's fleeting nature, then it may serve a noble purpose. However, if it awakens desires, distracts from worship, or encourages arrogance and sin, then it becomes blameworthy. His balanced approach demonstrates that the issue was never sound itself, but how sound interacts with the soul state. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, the great hadith scholar and commentator on Sahih al-Bukhari, addressed the technical debate about a hadith's authenticity. He confirmed that it has a valid chain of narration and that its meaning is reinforced by other prophetic sayings. His contribution focused less on emotional reasoning and more on scholarly rigor, ensuring that the hadith's place in Sahih al-Bukhari was recognized as authentic and trustworthy. Through his analysis, he provided a strong foundation for later scholars to base their moral discussions. What is remarkable across these interpretations is the consistency of concern. None of these scholars, even those who allowed limited forms of permissible sound, ever describe music as a path to spiritual growth. They viewed it as an emotional experience that can easily become addictive and spiritually draining. They feared not the melody but the attachment, the way it captures attention and replaces reflection with entertainment. Their collective wisdom shows that Islam's caution regarding music is not rooted in restriction but in protection. The scholars saw the human heart as fragile, easily influenced, and deeply responsive to what it hears. Therefore, anything that could distance it from divine remembrance required careful boundary. In essence, the scholars of Islam approached this topic with depth, compassion, and realism. They understood that humans are drawn to beauty, rhythm, and emotional expression, but they also recognize that unrestrained indulgence in these can weaken the connection with Allah. Their words serve as a timeless reminder that the aim of Islamic law is not to deprive, but to preserve the sanctity of the heart. Through their interpretations, they did not merely analyze a hadith. They taught generations how to protect their souls in a world full of distractions disguised as pleasure. The purpose behind the prohibition of music in Islamic teachings is deeply spiritual, not superficial. It is not a matter of controlling sound or art. Rather, it is about protecting the human heart, the center of faith, emotion, and morality. When Islam places boundaries, those boundaries are never meant to suppress beauty, but to preserve purity. The wisdom behind discouraging or prohibiting certain types of music lies in understanding its subtle influence on the soul, its power to manipulate emotion, and its potential to draw a believer away from remembrance of Allah. At the core of Islamic guidance is the recognition that the heart is constantly being shaped by what it sees, hears, and feels. Every experience leaves a mark on it, either a light that brings clarity or a shadow that darkens its sensitivity. Music, by its nature, affects emotions directly. It bypasses logic and penetrates the heart. That is why it can make people cry, laugh, feel nostalgic, or feel desire without any words of reasoning. This power is not inherently evil, but when misused, it becomes dangerous. Islam's concern is with what music often encourages. Not just the sound itself, but the atmosphere and mindset it creates. When people listen to music that glorifies love without boundaries, materialism, arrogance, or rebellion against moral values, their subconscious absorbs those messages. Over time, this shapes how they think and what they desire. It plants seeds of heedlessness, a state where the heart becomes numb to the remembrance of Allah. That is why many scholars compared music to an intoxicant. Just as wine clouds judgment and weakens self-control, music can intoxicate the emotions and weaken spiritual focus. It becomes a gentle addiction, one that doesn't destroy instantly, but gradually removes sincerity and reflection from the heart. The prohibition, therefore, is not about denying joy, but about redirecting it. Islam encourages the believer to find beauty and comfort in remembrance. In Quran, in nature, in prayer, in meaningful connection with others. When the Quran is recited, it carries a rhythm far more powerful than any melody, yet it purifies rather than distracts. The purpose of this balance is to ensure that joy is linked to spirituality, not to fleeting emotion. The Prophet ﷺ himself appreciated poetic expression and pleasant voices in recitation, but he drew a clear line when sound became a source of heedlessness. Another wisdom behind the prohibition lies in how music often becomes a tool for cultural and moral change. Throughout history, music has shaped trends, influenced ideologies, and normalized lifestyles that go against Islamic values. It glamorizes sin and trivializes faith. The gatherings where music dominates are rarely gatherings of remembrance. They are usually places where modesty fades and accountability is forgotten. The more one indulges in such environments, the harder it becomes to feel the sweetness of worship or the peace of solitude. The prohibition is thus a shield against gradual desensitization, a way to keep the believer alert to what pleases or displeases Allah. Furthermore, the human soul has a limited capacity for attachment. When that attachment is filled with worldly sounds and emotions, it leaves less room for divine remembrance. Music creates emotional highs, but when it fades, it leaves emptiness. Dhikr, on the other hand, fills that emptiness with purpose and tranquility. The aim of Islamic teaching is to help the believer choose what nourishes the heart, not what temporarily entertains it. In essence, the prohibition is not about sound, it is about sanctity. Allah does not forbid except that which harms. What He restricts, He replaces with something purer and more fulfilling. Where music captures emotion, Quran heals it. Where music excites desire, remembrance calms it. Where music leads to heedlessness, worship restores awareness. The wisdom behind this prohibition is one of mercy, a divine protection for hearts that were created to beat for Allah, not for the rhythm of the world. In today's world, the discussion about music has become more complex than ever before. Music is no longer limited to instruments or songs played at gatherings. It has become woven into the fabric of everyday life. It is in advertisements, movies, social media, and even in the background of the spaces we walk through. For many, silence has become uncomfortable, and music has become a constant companion. This modern saturation of sound has blurred the lines between art and addiction, between expression and distraction. The challenge for a believer today is not just about whether a specific song is halal or haram, but about how much influence this culture of endless entertainment has on the purity of the heart. In the early generations, music was something occasional. Now it is inescapable. It is not simply a form of entertainment anymore. It is an industry that shapes thought, emotion, and identity. The lyrics and videos that dominate the global music scene often promote values that are far from the teachings of Islam: arrogance, sensuality, rebellion, and the glorification of desire. Subtly, these messages train the heart to find joy in what displeases Allah and to feel distant from anything that reminds one of accountability. It's not just a song, it's a philosophy wrapped in rhythm. This is why the conversation about music in the modern era cannot be limited to technical rulings. It must also include awareness of influence and intention. Balance, however, is an important principle in Islam. The religion does not demand that people live as emotionless beings devoid of joy or expression. Beauty is part of Allah's creation, and sound can be one of the most beautiful manifestations of it. The question is whether that sound uplifts the soul or chains it. There are sounds that bring tranquility, the laughter of a child, the recitation of Quran, the birds at dawn, and there are sounds that pollute the heart and stir restlessness. A believer in the modern world must learn to distinguish between the two. The goal is not total silence, but mindful listening. It is undeniable that some forms of permissible nasheeds or spiritual songs, which contain words of remembrance or moral encouragement, can inspire and motivate the heart. These are not condemned by the scholars as long as they remain within limits and do not distract from worship or lead to arrogance, pride, or excessive indulgence. However, even these must be approached with moderation. What begins as spiritual can easily become an obsession if the heart becomes attached to the performer more than the message. Balance means understanding that what is meant to remind should never replace direct remembrance. Another aspect of balance in the modern context is self-awareness. Not everyone is affected by music in the same way, but everyone is affected by what they repeatedly consume. What we listen to gradually becomes what we think, and what we think eventually becomes what we feel. Therefore, the believer must evaluate, does this sound awaken my heart, or does it put it to sleep? Does it make me reflect on Allah or forget Him? This self-reflection is crucial because in a world filled with noise, silence itself becomes an act of worship. The person who can disconnect from constant sound and sit in quiet remembrance experiences a clarity that music can never provide. The modern world has made it easy to drown the discomfort of the soul with sound. Whenever we feel sadness, boredom, or emptiness, we reach for a playlist instead of a prayer. The balance Islam calls for is to replace that reaction with reflection, to pause and ask, what does my heart truly need right now? Sometimes what the heart needs is not rhythm but repentance, not melody but meaning. The wisdom of Islam remains timeless. It does not prohibit to punish, it restricts to protect. And in a generation addicted to noise, the greatest act of balance may simply be learning how to listen not to beats or lyrics, but to the quiet voice of faith within the heart. Guidance and self-reflection are at the heart of every believer's journey. Islam is not a religion of blind obedience. It is a path of awareness, understanding, and personal accountability. When it comes to matters like music or any issue that affects the heart, the true question a believer must ask is not only, is this allowed, but what is this doing to my soul? That is where real reflection begins. When one stops searching for loopholes and starts searching for truth, the human heart was created to find peace in remembrance of Allah, and anything that distracts it from that purpose deserves to be examined honestly. Self-reflection begins with sincerity. The believer asks not to argue but to grow. When a person genuinely seeks guidance, Allah opens the doors of clarity. But when the question is driven by ego or desire, the heart becomes clouded. The Quran reminds us that true guidance is reserved for those who approach it with humility, those who are willing to let revelation shape their choices rather than forcing their choices to shape revelation. That is why when faced with something doubtful, the Prophet advised, leave that which makes you doubt for that which does not make you doubt. This principle of clarity is the foundation of self-purification. In our time, where temptation and entertainment surround us from every direction, reflection is more necessary than ever. The believer must take moments of silence to observe what he or she consumes daily, the sounds, the images, the words, and how they affect the heart. Does what we listen to bring us closer to Allah or further away? Does it make prayer easier or harder? If the answer leans toward heedlessness, then the heart is signaling that something is wrong. Guidance begins by listening to that signal. The more we ignore it, the fainter it becomes until we no longer feel anything when doing wrong. That numbness is more dangerous than sin itself because it means the heart has stopped responding to truth. When one reflects deeply, they realize that Islam's teachings are never random or restrictive. Every command, every prohibition, every piece of advice from the Prophet carries spiritual wisdom. The guidance against music, for example, is not about denying joy, but about protecting spiritual focus. It's about preventing the heart from becoming addicted to what fades, so it can find fulfillment in what lasts. Reflection helps us see that what Allah forbids often aligns with what our fitra, our natural spiritual nature, already knows is harmful. The Quran says Allah does not burden a soul beyond what it can bear, and therefore His commands are always within our capacity and for our benefit. Self-reflection also demands honesty about one's weaknesses. It is easy to justify habits by saying it doesn't affect me, or others do worse. But the sincere believer knows that the goal is not comparison, it is connection. Connection with Allah and with one's own soul. The one who is honest with himself admits when something weakens his discipline, distracts his focus, or corrupts his heart. That honesty is the first step toward guidance. Once a person admits, this is making me forget Allah, the path to change opens. Allah's mercy is vast, and He never turns away the one who turns toward Him with sincerity. In moments of reflection, silence becomes sacred. When a believer withdraws from noise, even for a few minutes, and listens to his own thoughts, he can sense where his heart stands. Does it feel restless in remembrance or peaceful in sin? Does it crave the Quran or does it crave the next song? These questions, when asked sincerely, can transform a life, because guidance is not found in debates, but in quiet, honest. The one who reflects with a pure heart soon realizes that the peace they seek in worldly sounds exists only in the remembrance of Allah. Through reflection, the believer learns that leaving behind what harms the soul is not a loss but liberation, a step toward clarity, tranquility, and divine closeness. My beloved brothers and sisters, as we come to the close of this reflection, remember that the discussion about music is not just a debate about what is halal or haram, it is a mirror reflecting the condition of our hearts. The real question has never been, is the hadith, but have we become weak in our desire to please Allah, the Messenger of Allah, that not warn us out of restriction but out of mercy? He knew that the heart, when drowned in constant noise, begins to lose its ability to recognize divine whisper. The purpose of this entire discussion is not to make life harder, but to help us live with clarity. Every sound we choose to listen to shapes who we become. Every moment we spend in heedlessness could have been a moment of remembrance. When we understand that our hearts are precious, that they were created to hold the love of Allah, not the echoes of the world, we begin to protect them with care. The believer does not ask, how much can I get away with? But how close can I get to Allah? That mindset transforms everything. The hadith about music stands as a timeless reminder, not to condemn art but to awaken awareness. It teaches us to be mindful of what we feed our souls. Just as we avoid food that harms the body, we must avoid sounds that poison the spirit. True beauty lies not in rhythm or melody, but in the peace that descends when the Quran is recited, when dhikr flows from the tongue, and when tears fall in sujood. That is the real music of the heart, the song of faith, the melody of remembrance, the harmony of peace. So let us not be people who argue about authenticity while ignoring the message. Let us instead be people who hear the Prophet's warning and protect our hearts with wisdom. The path to Allah is not about silence alone, it's about sound with purpose. Replace the songs of the world with the verses of the Quran. Replace distraction with devotion. Replace fleeting pleasure with everlasting peace. May Allah purify our hearts from anything that distances us from Him. And may He fill our lives with the sound of His remembrance. May we be among those who find beauty not in what the world plays, but in what the soul feels when it remembers its Creator.